Okay, I wanted to show you today my spline cutting jig and setup. This is my test piece that I did for another project where you can see I've cut the splines into the corners and just never placed the splines themselves, although I did that in another corner testing the project out there. In order to cut those, you have to build a jig. Here's my jig. I was able to pick up a scrap piece of plywood at my local wood store. This is actually pre-finished on both sides, cabinet grade plywood that I cut up, and then I had some thinner stock that I used for the actual bed of the jig here. But it's a fairly simple process. You cut a couple of square ends. There's not much to it. The size you need, I used just screws and glue to put this together, cutting these at a perfect 45, and then using a spacer to set that distance there so that I could potentially cut all the way up to the edge or close to the edge using the blade and still using this full width of the jig itself. Again, cut 45-degree angle, set using a spacer so you know it's pretty exact, and then double checking all your measurements, of course. Same thing for the other side. Getting it all set up, and you can see if I hadn't spaced it like that, this cut would have been through my blocks here and potentially through my screws. So I just gave myself plenty of room, knowing that if I ever need to cut deeper and that close to the edge, I just probably need to use a spacing block in here in order to not hit those parts. But you just place your piece in there, the angle you need. You can clamp it in, whatever you need to do. Set your dado at the width you need and run it through. The nice thing is you can reuse those holes if you're cutting consistent splines. You know, once you get set up for one corner, you just flip it several times to get the other corners. Potentially flip it the other way to have even spacing from the perimeter without having to reset your table. And you can cut the next splines, again, flipping those end to end to cut them consistently on each side. It's a pretty simple jig to build. It's pretty easy to use. You could always replace these pieces as needed if you get them too cut up. And the thing is, you need to make sure that when you're cutting your splines that you're using a hole that's either there and the width of the blade, or that's a little bit smaller than, so that when you run it through you don't have chip out. That's one of the problems there. But if you ever need to replace the bed, it would just be easy as pulling these screws, take another piece of, in this case it's 1/2-inch plywood. I mitered the bottom edge so it can sit fairly flat, and then you know, putting in those new pieces. So it's a fairly simple jig, easy to use, easy to build if you ever need to cut splines. There you go.